your points across. That makes the session a lot more engaging. Matthew has blessed me with this wonderful time slot right after lunch, so it would be hard to keep everybody awake if I just keep droning by myself. So I would make the session a bit more engaging. Can I quickly get a sense of how many people in the audience are from electrical engineering background? Raise of hands. Okay, so anybody from a non-electrical engineering background? Raise of hands.
Yeah, that would be a better question.
Yeah, I think please raise your hands if you're not from an electrical engineering background. And most people here are Rekha and Krishna Rao. Are you not from an electrical engineering background? Okay.
We are very much from
Most
electrical
people
engineering
here.
background.
Sorry, Mr. Rao, I couldn't hear you. Can you repeat?
I'm from electrical engineering background.
All right.
From electrical engineering
So
background.
most people here, I presume, are from college teacher category, and will be teaching power systems. Is that the general? I mean, are you from power systems and controls background? Is that a correct assessment, Matthew?
Yeah, so most of them are from power system control background.
All right, great. Okay, so hopefully this talk should be it's targeted for a more wider audience. But if at all you still have any questions, again, as I said, please feel free to stop me and get any doubts clarified as we go. So I'm going to talk about. For the past couple of years, I've actually been working more in the domain of building energy management. So when Matthew asked me to speak on economics of smart grids, it threw me a bit off track because I've primarily been working on how to manage building energy better. But I had a PhD student graduate during the COVID year, and he had worked on something which I think can be tied to the broad area of economics of smart grids. He's in fact Matthew's good friend Joes. So I'm going to present Joel's work mostly here. And I've tried to break it down into pieces that make sense. Joel basically started off working on how to improve service reliability, and while we were looking at it more from a power engineering perspective, today what I will do is tie in the economic background for why that service reliability is even important in the first place. And if time permits, we'll also talk of scheduling of interactions between the utility and the grid, which has a more deeper economic connection. But that work is still in preliminary stages, so I don't know how much of it I can completely present. So that's going to be the main outline of today's talk. Before I get into the talk itself, I think in terms of developments that are going on a national scale, everybody must be aware of the fact that we have these. India has gone quite aggressive in terms of looking at carbon emissions, and electricity sector, which unfortunately is a very visible sector of carbon emissions, bears a big brunt of this. So we have adopted fairly aggressive targets of renewable installations, and we are doing quite well. We are quite on track in terms of meeting our targets. We want 175 gigawatts of renewables by next year. In fact, we are doing so well that there have been talks of revising this 175 gigawatts to 225 gigawatts, although I don't think an official order has come on this, to make sure that we can evacuate all this 175 gigawatts of energy. We have also looked at the transmission of it. So there is this, all the green that you see here, that's the green corridor for transmission, that is basically ensuring that the solar and wind from this area in Rajasthan and Gujarat, the wind from Tamil Nadu, all of this can actually be transported across the country to make sure it reaches all our major load centers. This is on the supply side of things. On the demand side of things, we have a few changes coming up as well. All governments in power have aggressively planned for uh, electrification of villages, and there have been many yojanas that have come for rural electrification. I think the current number is maybe 97 or 98% villages electrified. There's a bit of debate on what electrification of villages means as far as the Ministry of Power is concerned, and what I as a power engineer would want to believe is electrification. But nonetheless, by their loose definition, we have about 98% villages electrified. And in addition to this, a completely new demand segment that's expected to come up for electricity grids is the electric vehicle segment. So that charging load of plug-in hybrids and plug-in electric vehicles is something that will start to manifest itself 2025 onwards. And this is also tied in with other programs in terms of energy efficiency, the Ujala scheme, and so on. So all these changes in the power sector have manifested itself in many different ways. We have basically on the distribution side many renewable resources coming up. A lot of people are putting in solar panels. There is a lot of interest in from the utility side to engage with the consumers so that they can leverage better tariffs. They can leverage demand side flexibility in what we call as through demand side response programs and so on. The other things that we are now starting to see more often are industries coming together and having their own captive generation, small communities coming together and investing in community-owned resources like solar panels and pumped hydro and so on. These are things that are becoming a big reality now, and that means microgrids and nanogrids really are no longer just a pipe dream. They are already in place. Many of them are also now grid connected. They're not really disconnected, decentralized energy solution systems anymore. On the side of technology, in addition to all of these social and technical developments, there are other things that are also happening in terms of better sensing and ICT available. So there's a lot of metering infrastructure that has come in. There's a lot of improved automation infrastructure available. So this has led to many new questions for a regular utility. How do you actually service your customer better? And that is what I'm going to focus on today. So what hasn't changed is the fact that consumers still want affordable and reliable power. So what does this mean for anybody of you? What does affordable power mean for you? Anybody from the audience? I purposely used the word cheap and not afford, I've not used the word cheap, I've used the word affordable. Any thoughts on this?
Quality power, ma'am, at desired price?
At a price that you're comfortable paying. Quality is a good word you've put here. What do you mean by quality power? Can you elaborate?
The voltage is stable and the continuity of the power remains uninterrupted.
Great. You've already talked of continuity of power, right? So you're talking of service quality, both in terms of what we as power engineers understand in terms of, the sinusoidal nature and what we want. We want the voltage to be of a particular frequency, and the harmonic content in it has to be limited to a certain acceptable threshold. You've talked of, I think you're alluding to that, and the continuity of power really talks about the fact that if you're going to give me great quality power but only 1 hour a day, that may not be useful, right? Or unexpectedly I'm going to face service interruptions. That's not something I would like either. So that's the reliable power, and most consumers want that, right? Your natural expectation when you turn on a switch in your house is that the light just comes on. You don't really worry about what machinery is at work to make sure that the light you turn on here immediately turns on, which means there is something happening in the grid to make sure that without actual knowledge of you turning on the light, that light does turn on exactly when you want it to turn on. And there's a lot of machinery in place to make that happen, right? So that comes at a cost. But what affordable power means is this cost should not outweigh the benefit. You get certain benefit by having that light on. There's a certain utility that you experience when you turn on that light, and that extra, the utility that I get, the benefit I derive from having the light turn on when I want it to turn on, it should not outweigh how much I'm paying to the utility. This is the whole economic principle, right? I'm only willing to buy power till it is in my benefit to buy it. If the cost of reliable power for me is going to far outweigh how much benefit I derive from it, then I would just say, forget this. I would just install a solar panel. Solar panels are now cheap. I can put in a solar panel, I can put in a battery. What do I lose when I do that? If I put in a solar panel and a battery and just disconnect myself from the grid, go off the grid, so to speak, what is it that I'm risking here? Any thoughts?
Reliability, ma'am. Continuity of supply.
Correct. There is a greater chance that maybe my battery is not completely full, the sun doesn't shine as bright as I want, so that continuity may be lost, right? So that economics has to play out. The utility has to provide me power at a tariff where the solar and battery combination doesn't become attractive to me. Correct? So it has to be affordable. The power that comes to me has to be affordable. It has to be reliable. Now, utilities, on the other hand, the other side of the equation, if we look at, they want to stay in business. They know that consumers have access to solar panels. Till quite a few years back, they had significant subsidies also, in fact. So consumers could avail of a lot of subsidies to make sure that the whole solar battery combination works out economically for them. But if that was to happen, the utilities are going to lose their energy sales business, right? So they want to stay in business. They want to make sure that they are able to provide this affordable and reliable power. But in ensuring that it is reliable, there is a lot of things that a utility has to do to make sure that they can provide reliable power to you. And this incurs some investments that they have to make, which means it's a planning cost. And in routine operations also, they have to make good decisions where to procure power from, how much to buy from the market, how much to, whatever contracts they may have signed in terms of supply contracts, which contract to leverage so that they can get the best possible operational cost and minimal cost. And so that, the tariff and the cost equation works out quite well, so they can make profits, right? So reliability and economics, these are two factors that have continued to drive utility decisions since early 1900s, when power actually became a business, since the Pearl Street station, and they still continue to drive utility decisions. Okay, so utilities don't necessarily care whether it's green power for them or it's black power like coal wala power. What they care about eventually is it reliable, is it affordable, right? Those are the two things that the utilities care. And simultaneously, now there is a lot of technology advancement they have in terms of automation options available, so that they can continue to service their consumers with the best possible reliability and the best possible affordability in terms of supply. So if you really think about it, why does it matter? Why does this reliability matter? So here I think this is a 2019 report from this source. There are various possible business segments. There's batch manufacturing, continuous manufacturing, digital economy, healthcare, grocery stores. This is how much it cost them if the power was to be interrupted for a short duration of time. So as you can see, as expected, batch manufacturing, that's the one that takes the most hit. So these are things, for example, everybody knows what is batch manufacturing? Do you guys know what is batch manufacturing? So, for instance, if there's there's a process, for example, in the silicon industry, when they're trying to manufacture ICs, for instance, right? It goes through certain steps, and until a particular, so once a step starts, it has to complete. If a process is interrupted, if that batch process is interrupted, basically that entire IC batch becomes useless. Okay, and that's just how the way it works. So the cost of interruption for these sort of industries is very, very high, because if something was in cycle, so a process has already started and suddenly they were to lose power, what it would imply is that entire batch basically has to be thrown off. Okay, and in terms of financial services also, you can imagine, for example, if the power was down for a while, none of the servers are going to work, and that's going to cause severe disruptions in terms of what transactions can be carried out and so on. So a cost of outage for a digital economy also is significant, and it can cause a significant dent in their profit margins. Healthcare is also, in fact, a significant segment where if power was to go down, they would suffer a significant cost. But usually, as far as hospitals are concerned, at least as much as I know, most of them have backup generators. It's the same for grocery stores also. So these costs are, you would think that, we value lives more than we would value our ICs and financial services, but they do have better backup systems as well. So that's how the cost economics sort of plays out. By the way, these are not costs that someone has just come up with. There was a survey conducted for many, many different electricity end users, and from this survey, this is what was the estimated cost of an outage. So the point I'm trying to drive here is that any power outage has severe economic consequences, and so it is in the best interest of both the consumers as well as the utilities to make sure that service outages are avoided as much as possible. This is also in line with new regulation that has been coming up. So, for example, we already have things in place where utilities are subjected to deviation settlement mechanism, and they are already subject to things like power purchase agreements. They have short term uncertainty in terms of what the market would give them. In addition to all this, now the utilities are penalized if a consumer on their network would face outage. For 1 hour, they may have to pay 50 rupees. For 2 hours, they have to pay 100 rupees to each consumer on their network. So this is a huge financial incentive for the utilities to make sure that they make their network, or they operate their network in a way that service interruptions are minimal. Okay, so the question is, how do they actually deliver something like this in the face of all the changes that are happening in terms of behind the meter investments in solar panels, metering infrastructure available, better ICTs, and so on. Okay, so the first part of my presentation I'm going to talk about is a new concept to enable something called as microgrid based operations. So I'll introduce this concept now. So microgrids, everybody understands what's a microgrid? Have you heard this term before, a microgrid?
Yeah, yes.
What anybody wants to explain their own understanding of what it is that constitutes a microgrid?
Its boundary is very small.
Okay. So it's basically nothing but a small collection of loads and supply resources, right? Basically, you have a few supply resources, typically distributed energy resources, small scale supply resources, and some loads connected together, right? And there are various modes in which these microgrids can function. They can either be connected to a main grid, your utility grid. So that's what we call as grid connected microgrids, or it could be an isolated system, which we could refer to as islanded microgrid. It's an island by itself. It's not connected to any other electrical system, right? And but if we look at a distribution network, okay, in a distribution network, it's possible that, let's say, multiple groups of buildings connected on the network have their own solar panels and so on, right? So we could conceive of several groups of loads and distributed energy resources like solar panels and so on, which together can be thought of as forming a grid connected microgrid. And this is exactly the kind of concept we want to bring in to improve service reliability. Now, groups of microgrids cooperating together is not a new concept at all. Okay, so there have been various papers put together on how you can have a hierarchical control architecture for a nanogrid talking to a microgrid, talking to a bigger utility grid, and so on and so forth. So this is not a new concept where multiple microgrids work together. Cooperation within microgrids to do transactive control, transactions of energy, and so on. This is again something not new at all. We are talking of a slightly different concept here. So what I have shown here is a typical 69 bus distribution feeder. This feeder is based off of, if I'm not mistaken, Southern California Edison's. It's a utility feeder based off an actual utility feeder in Southern California Edison's network. So there are two substations here, substation 1, substation 2, and then out of these two substations rise out 4 feeders, as you can see here. What we want to do is want to figure out, can we look at a microgrid sort of concept to improve your service restoration? So I'll explain this with an example. See, what happens in a typical business as usual scenario is, if there is a service interruption, let's say this segment 5-6. Can you see my pointer here? Is my pointer
we can see the cursor.
All right, yeah. So what would happen, for example, if there was a fault on this segment 5-6, the line that is connecting node 5 and 6, right? If there was in fact a fault on this segment, how would the utility address this fault? Does anybody know?
That segment can be isolated.
All right, Matthew, is that you?
Yeah, it is GB Matthew.
Okay, yeah. So different Matthew, sorry. Yeah. So the other Matthew, you were saying that what would happen if there was a fault here, 5,6?
That particular segment can be isolated, and
so before you isolate this, typically what happens is there's a momentary interruption. Usually there'll be a big circuit breaker here, and this entire feeder, right? This entire feeder is going to get disconnected, de-energized for a while, and then this 5-6 would be isolated with the help of isolating switches, right? Then what would happen, Matthew? Once this isolation is done, what would happen?
Then we can energize again from other parts of.
So once you turn on the circuit breaker here, right? The parts of circuit that I'm highlighting right now, these nodes 2, 3, 4, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, all of them can get energized again up to node 5 actually, right? But these nodes 7, 8, 9, 68, 69, currently things are in such a way that these nodes are going to continue to remain offline because this 5-6 has been isolated. So this link is no longer functional. Everybody can see this? Everybody with me?
Yes.
Yes? So Matthew, what would happen next? Any idea?
Then we can energize 6, 7, 8, 9 from nearby microgrids.
Correct. So there are no microgrids as of now. I'll come to the microgrids in a bit. But what you can do is, does everybody see these dotted lines? The dotted lines that I have shown here are what we call as tie lines. Has anybody heard of this term before? Tie lines?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam.
Do you know what is a tie line? Anybody?
Yeah, tie line. It's a line connecting two areas, madam.
So it's basically a normally open switch of sorts. Okay? Yeah, it's a normally open switch. So we've purposely shown them as dotted because this switch is not actually in service. But if you were to close the normally open switch, the tie line is usually a normally open switch. If I was to close this switch, for example, the one connecting nodes 15 and 67, I could in fact re-energize all the downstream nodes from this 5-6. All the nodes that were downstream could now be shifted onto this feeder by energizing 15 and 67 link, right? So that tie line, if I was to close, then I could basically reservice these nodes. Any other options you can see here for reservicing? Anybody?
From the source
If
at
I was to
68,
load the same feeder, then I could in fact close 14, 15 also. That's another option. Any other options?
no, madam, there is a source at bus 68.
Yeah, we'll get to those sources in a bit. For now, just think of the nodes and just think of the business as usual strategy. We'll think of I'll bring in the local sources in just a little bit, okay? But right now I'm still thinking of establishing service back through the substation itself, which is the usual utility practice.
Okay.
Any thoughts? So one option I mentioned was this 1567 could be closed. The other is 1415 can be closed. Any other options you can see? Anybody?
Similarly, we can MG6 from 38 or 46 or 49.
Right. So there is this 38, 938 or 1546 or 5049, correct? Those are the ones you're referring to. Any of these, so there are so many switches actually available for us. All these tie lines, any one of them could have been used basically to reconnect all these downstream nodes and just reroute the power, okay? So basically in doing this whole process, so what is the process that we have to do? We basically have to de-energize this entire feeder, right? Isolate 5-6, and then we reservice and reroute power through any of these switches, 14, 15, 15, 67, and so on and so forth, right? So basically in doing this, there's a momentary interruption that all the nodes are going to face, and that momentary interruption is because this whole process has to go through de-energizing, then re-energizing, and then potentially rerouting the power. So what we want to do is a priori identify groups. So if there were behind the meter investments, so let's say there were solar resources here, there could be a micro wind turbine here, there could be a few more solar panels, battery options, and so on available here. So all these smaller supply points that we have shown here, these are basically behind the meter sources already available, right? So what we want to do is a priori identify groups of loads that could in fact be serviced by these local sources, right? And what we want to do is then exercise islanding option that a microgrid naturally provides, either to contain the impact of a fault within that microgrid itself, or to exclude the impact of a fault that was to occur outside the microgrid. And in doing so, you try to make sure that your service interruption is minimized as much as possible. Okay, so for example, if the fault was to occur in this 5-6, right? What we want to do is maybe break this up into a microgrid and break this up into another microgrid and make sure that the impact of the fault is contained outside of the microgrid and it doesn't really percolate within the microgrid. So lesser loads were to experience a service interruption. Is the concept sort of clear at a higher level? Are you guys following what I'm saying?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, great. So basically, now the question is, how do you do this identification, right? That's the main question. And there have been quite a few papers. When we started this work in 2016 or so, there were not too many papers. Now this concept has become very, very common. So the idea is, if you look at it from a graph theory perspective, you really have to identify cut sets, right, based on historical data. Like, where do you actually draw the boundaries? Like, this is one microgrid and this is another microgrid. So you want to identify clusters of supply and demand nodes, which enable you to say that, okay, this together is going to constitute my microgrid, and these groups of nodes together are going to constitute my microgrid. So that is what we were trying to focus on. And what we wanted to do was make sure that these microgrids are all grid connected. When everything is okay in the grid, if there is no fault, they all work in tandem, right? And basically they just continue to naturally exchange energy and pump it, either get it from the main grid or pump it back to the main grid, so that supply demand imbalance that microgrids are naturally going to have would be directly managed through grid interactions. But if at all there was a fault for which the microgrids were islanded, in that case, then we would have to do things like voluntary load shedding, like demand response, storage if available, some sort of droop control if needed, and worst cases, of course, involuntary load shed. That's the worst thing to do, but that would be a last case option, so to speak. Okay. And what we wanted to do, make sure is we dynamically keep adapting the boundaries of the microgrid, so that areas that are, if there is, more production locally available, then more nodes that are connected to loads can be serviced. And if there is lesser production available, then lesser nodes are serviced. So just to see, for example, currently, this is a 33 bus distribution feeder, standard distribution feeder from IEEE. Okay, and we have set some loads and supply locations here. Now, if it could happen, for example, that the production here in these local resources increases, in which case the boundary of the microgrid has, as you can see from this figure, it has dynamically adapted, and that has also led to a different balance of power in the overall structure. So earlier, for example, there was a 70 kilowatt surplus power in this cluster, 10 kilowatt deficit in this cluster, 40 kilowatt surplus here, 35 here, no exact supply demand balance here. Now there is some adapting of boundaries, and the surplus and deficit structure has also changed, as you can see. Okay. And you can also see that this manifests as a change also in what is happening with the utility side. Okay, how much power you are pumping to the utility or taking back from the utility. So this is what we were referring to as dynamic microgrids. We keep adapting the boundaries of our microgrids to make sure that we can manage the supply and demand balance within the microgrid as well as possible. We want to minimize that imbalance as much as possible. So the philosophy is that if we keep adapting the boundaries of the microgrid to changing supply demand conditions, which could change maybe every few minutes, then you're better prepared to handle potential disasters. If a fault was to occur, at that time you have already naturally clustered the best possible supply and demand nodes, and so you will be able to better handle the islanding, if at all that was to happen. Is there a question from the audience?
Yeah, there is one.
Yes, ma'am. In the last slide, you showed the boundaries of the microgrid, and there were some tie lines. What are these, ma'am?
So the tie lines are still there. Actually, though they have, I have not yet discussed what role the tie lines can play. So these, in typical distribution networks, we always have these tie lines. So these tie lines still exist, but right now the microgrid nodes are clustered only based on supply demand conditions. We have not actually considered tie lines. So when these boundaries that we have drawn, or these clusters that you can see have been identified purely on the basis of supply demand balance and connectivity in regular lines, not tie lines. We haven't actually considered tie line connectivity. So for instance, you could have clubbed this and this microgrid together through this tie line, but because they're electrically currently isolated, this tie line is an open switch. So because they are electrically isolated, we have not clubbed these two grids together. The imbalance could have been better, right? You have 70 kilowatt surplus here and minus 10 kilowatts. So there's a 10 kilowatt deficit here. Together, you could have had a 60 kilowatt surplus and a better imbalance profile. But because there's an electrical isolation here, we have not really clubbed them together.
Got it, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I actually forgot to mention the tie lines. Yeah, and I think in the one of the concluding slides, I do mention the role that tie lines can play, but we haven't actually, in this particular diagram, we haven't considered the presence of tie lines. That's a good question. Thank you. Any other questions on this example? Is the concept clear? Can I move on?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
All right, great. All right. So I think the philosophy, as I said, of these dynamically adapting the boundaries of the microgrid is simply to make sure that we are better prepared to handle a potential islanding situation because of a fault. Okay, that's the only reason to go ahead. Of course, there's there could be an overhead involved in actually doing this identification, but there's also going to be an overhead involved in an islanding situation if you did not have the right kind of supply and demand balances in place. So there's sort of a, you have to do a cost benefit analysis eventually. So the question when we first thought of this was, okay, has somebody done something like this before? And at that time, similar concepts had come in terms of just articles. People had talked of natural microgrids that should evolve to more locally controlled microgrids, to a distributed control architecture, and to a completely dynamic microgrid. This was really just a concept that people had put in utility articles and so on. No one had actually formalized it. Now it has become a lot more formal to think about it. This concept started as something in 2010 or 2011, and over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of structure put in terms of how do you actually think about this, how do you formalize this problem, and so on, right? So we start to formalize it. The first question we have to ask is, okay, how do you define this dynamic microgrid? So for sure, if it's a microgrid, then there has to be at least one source in it. So one local supply has to be there. There has to be at least one sink in it. So there has to be one load, so to speak. And in addition to this, you would still need other things. So you have to think of, if you were to island, how are you going to manage the supply and demand, which means you may need some sources of flexibility in terms of storage or loads that are flexible and so on. You need reactive power support. More from a power engineering perspective, we need ancillary support in terms of reactive power support, VAR support, and so on. And we want electrical connection, and potentially maybe you want geographical proximity also, because traditionally microgrids, someone had just mentioned, they have smaller boundaries. So which means we don't want, a load in, say, Kandivli to be tagged with a load in Dadar or a supply in Dadar. I mean, we want some sort of, these are localities in Bombay. So for instance, you don't want something in TKM college to be mapped to something. So in Kollam, Matthew, there's this lighthouse that we had visited when we went to TKM. I don't remember how far it is from TKM, but it seems like it would be electrically sufficiently far enough. So you may not want that sort of load and supply grouping, right? And of course, you want some flexibility to be able to split or merge microgrids, which the tie lines naturally provide you with, but you may want more tie lines for this also. So what we thought we can contribute to is first identifying how to define these microgrids, and after the identification, also figure out if there is a cost benefit analysis play out if we were to adopt a strategy like this. So we tried a few approaches. One approach we tried was just looking at graph theory. Inspired from graph theory, can we do clustering of nodes? And then the other approach we tried was looking at an optimization formulation to identify this partitioning. So spectral partitioning actually is fairly simple. It just looks at a weighted graph of your distribution grid. Here we use the power flow on each link as a natural weight. And this is information that your SCADA systems can automatically provide the utility with. So you don't need to do any additional investigations. It's just measurements that can directly feed into your partitioning algorithm. So you use a weighted graph of that matrix to identify K clusters. So sorry, I keep, I was here. Yeah, so to identify K clusters. And the only drawback of this is a partitioning in this manner needs to know what the value of K is. And that can be a problem because you may not know whether the system is best grouped as 3 microgrids or 4 microgrids or 5 microgrids, which would make K equal to 3, 4 or 5. So that becomes a problem, and that is not an easy problem to solve. But there are certain things like you can use some sort of singular value decomposition to discover a K for yourself. We have had some experiments to figure that out, but we don't have a complete sort of closed loop solution, so to speak, to give you a idea of what K should be per se. Okay. The other problem with spectral partitioning is that it will just identify cluster of nodes, but you are not able to guarantee, for instance, that a particular set of nodes grouped together would in fact have at least one source, one sink, what we had discussed here. Right? We had said that it's a microgrid, so it should at least have one source of generation and one source of one sink and maybe some sources of flexibility. So no properties of the node can be represented if you were to purely look at a partitioning approach. So in that case, an optimization approach works better, because now what we are able to do is we want to say that we want to formulate an objective, let's say minimize the total imbalance in the network such that each cluster would have at least one source, each cluster would have at least one sink, each cluster should have at least some source of flexibility, and so on and so forth. And this we can formulate as a mixed integer linear programming approach. For a good reason, I have not put in all the equations here because at 3:15 in the afternoon is not the best time to formulate a mixed integer program. But if someone is really, really interested to look at the optimization formulation, please write to me and I would be happy to share that paper with anybody. Yeah. Any questions so far? Can I move on?
Yes.
Ma'am, any book you can suggest on this microgrids?
So this particular topic, there have been lots of papers in IEEE Transactions of Smart Grids and IEEE Systems Journal in the last, I think, 5 or 6 years. Microgrids in general, there is a lot of books as well as reports from Horizon 2020 projects in Europe have come out, and I would really recommend you to look at that. So there is I think there's a book I have referenced here. Let me share with you very quickly. This one. This is a very good starting point if you're just getting into microgrids. It's Nicholas. I can't pronounce his last name. It's a very hard last name. H-A-T Hadz. It's a very hard one, but you can look at this textbook, Microgrids Architectures and Control. This book.
Thank you, ma'am.
This book has come about as a result of a few research experiments, pilot demonstrations, I think in Europe and elsewhere. So it's also, there's a lot of practical insights on pilot demonstrations. And I believe that there's also a report in 2019 on the same project that led to this book. A more advanced version of the project called More Microgrids was funded by Horizon 2020 in Europe. And there has also been a set of reports published or a book published in that, but that's not, I have not recently looked at it, so I don't remember, but I think it's 2019 or 2020. If you can take a look at the same author, actually would be the editor of that book. Yeah. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. All right. So, okay. So coming back to these approaches, yeah. So these are ways potentially. So you can, two ways to identify microgrids. One is, of course, the spectral partitioning approach, which just looks at a weighted graph of the network and then tries to identify clusters of nodes in that graph. The other is where you go full-fledged mixed integer programming, where you define properties of the nodes, make sure that your constraints for each cluster are well defined, and then you identify clusters based on that. Now, once all of this definition is done, what we tried to do was figure out, okay, how does having this sort of defined microgrid, how does that help us do service restoration? So the idea was simple. If we were to do usual service restoration, what we are going to do is during a fault, the distributed resources, all distributed generation would be de-energized during a fault, and then you are going to have de-energizing of the feeder, isolation, and then rerouting of power, as we discussed at the start of this talk. If we were to do microgrid operations, then what we are going to do is these distributed generation need not be de-energized. It will continue to service the loads within its microgrid boundary, and we are going to exercise switching. Islanding would be exercised to either contain a fault or to exclude the impact of a fault. All right. And so, for example, let's the same 33 bus system. I'm going to show this one example. If basically, let's look at this 7-8 line. We'll go back to. I apologize for doing this back and forth. So let's say this 7-8, right? This section was faulted. There's only one feeder. We would have to de-energize here, which means the entire load at that time would be disconnected and would face a momentary interruption. On the other hand, if we were to exercise some sort of islanding, then a lesser load is going to experience a service interruption, and that is exactly what this is showing. You can see, for example, any segment, when there is a fault on that segment, that entire loading on the feeder at that time is going to experience an interruption. On the other hand, if certain sections were faulted, we see a much lesser load interrupted if we were to embrace a microgrid based service restoration strategy, as we had discussed. Okay, and these scenarios refer to different loading conditions on the network and different supply conditions in the network as well. So this is not enough evidence clearly. I'm going to present a more detailed Monte Carlo based simulation based assessment in the next few slides, so just bear with me for a couple of minutes. This was again done on various systems where different scenarios were generated. Each scenario refers to a different loading condition as well as different capacity on the DGs, either full capacity or 78% of the load or 55% of the load. And I'll quickly get to basically what we did to do a more comprehensive assessment. So see, the point is, if you were to embrace a philosophy like this, there is a lot that needs to change. First is the grid code would need to change. Current grid code requires distributed resources to be de-energized during a fault, right? We would have to change that. We would have to also change the kind of converters we use to make sure that they can in fact work even in the absence of the main grid connection. Protection schemes would have to change. Switching sequences would have to be defined to make sure that you can actually identify the microgrid and so on and so forth. So the natural question to ask is it really worth all this trouble? Should we actually do all of this? So what we did was we did a whole bunch of Monte Carlo simulations to try and understand how much service reliability are we improving by putting in all this infrastructure in place. And so this is what we tried to do. We tried to evaluate the usual reliability metrics. Are you guys familiar with these metrics? Have you heard these terms before? SAIFI, SAIDI, expected demand not served. Any of these terms are familiar to anybody? Anyone in the audience knows what is expected demand not served?
Yes, ma'am. They are power quality indices.
Sorry?
Power quality indices.
Yeah. These are reliability indices, not really a quality index as much as this is related to continuity in service. So it's more of a reliability or availability a performance indicator. Okay. So these are usually indices that utilities are required to report. So let's say every 6 months or every year, they are expected to report how many interruptions happened, how many customers were interrupted, and these interruptions are defined in two different ways. It's a sustained interruption if it lasts longer than some 10 minutes or so. If it's a short interruption, less than 5 minutes, then it's referred to as a momentary interruption. And so the frequency of interruptions, the duration of interruptions, as well as the total demand that you interrupted, all of these together are used to define these indices in terms of SAIFI, SAIDI, MEFI, MEDI. MEFI is basically momentary average interruption frequency index. MEDI is momentary average interruption duration index. So these are frequency and duration indices that regulators use to characterize the performance of a utility in terms of how reliable it's the supply they are able to provide. So we did the calculation of these indices by running through a whole bunch of Monte Carlo simulations in two different scenarios. One is where the business as usual strategy would be implemented, which means de-energizing, isolation, and then rerouting of power. The other strategy was we identify the cluster and then if needed do islanding and try to maintain continuity of supply to as many loads as possible. So basically what happens is, I will quickly get to the results. These were data that we generated from as many available resources as possible. Some of it came from Europe data sets, some of it came from National Grid. We generated our own sets of supply and demand scenarios for the grid, and then these were the data sets we generated for local resources and local loads at each node. And then we calculated basically under the business as usual strategy, what would be these reliability indices, what would be the reliability indices if we were to have predefined microgrid boundaries, what would be the reliability indices if we had dynamically adapted microgrid boundaries. And you can note that if you have tie switches in the network, then mostly loads are going to face only a momentary interruption. So the main advantage by having these microgrid based operations comes in how much improvement you can get in your momentary average interruption frequency or momentary average interruption index. Sorry, this is duration and this is frequency. So this is number of failures and this is my D. There's a typo here. I apologize for that. So the momentary interruption related indices, both frequency and duration, they improve if we were to do microgrid based operations. We don't see that much improvement in sustained interruptions, so to speak. And that makes sense because sustained interruptions typically are already addressed through rerouting of power. So it's really the momentary interruptions that we can try to minimize. Does this make sense? Everybody sort of gets a gist of the contributions? Sorry, is there a comment from the audience? Sorry, is there a comment from the I'm going to just quickly go ahead and talk of the other results. So same sort of things, we did it on multiple systems, and we saw this consistent improvement in a lot of reliability indices, which allowed us to look at, okay, what is the potential architecture that we can use to leverage this. So what we think is there's something called as distribution management systems. This is a software, it's an energy management software provided by big companies like Siemens and ABBs. Something like this could easily sit in a distribution management system software. Its architecture is, forget this pink box, but this distribution management system usually looks like this. It would interface with your SCADA network. It's going to take measurements from the SCADA network to first process the topology. This is the network topology processor. So it would process your topology. It would run a power flow, distribution power flow. It would run a state estimation exercise. And then based on that, some predefined control algorithms would be there that would be implemented through this module called as switch order management, or this module called as volt-var control. Okay. And then there's going to be another important module, which is your fault location, right? So this fault location, isolation, and restoration, FLISR, that's the typical module that's existing in a distribution management system. Instead of FLISR, what we could have is we only have the fault location module, and then we replace the identification and service restoration module of it with this dynamic microgrid configurator, which would in turn decide which switches to turn on or turn off to do the isolation of your microgrids and also to do your volt-var control. Does that make sense to everybody? A few technology enablers that are going to be needed here are, of course, we have to look at protection. More advanced protection schemes would be needed, and a lot of communication may be needed to enable this. And all of this naturally fits into the new automation and ICT interventions that are coming up. So we do think there may be some hope for something like this to come up in the future that would really make the economics play out a lot better for consumers as well as the utility. Okay. Lastly, I'm going to have one remark here on something that someone had mentioned. What do you do with the tie lines? So for example, I think I discussed this already. This cluster C5 could have been merged with either this surplus cluster or this surplus cluster, because this is a deficit cluster, by leveraging a tie line. So you can naturally look at some splitting or merging of microgrids to better manage your imbalance. This could either be done in your optimization framework itself, or it could be done as a post-processing, but we have not really looked at that step when we did our work. It's more of a future work that we have identified. So some final thoughts on this are, this is already published in Joel's thesis, of course, and also as a conference paper. We did not actually publish this as a, we published a part of this as a paper in IEEE Systems Journal only recently, but that's not the whole and soul of it, just a part of this work was published. So some final thoughts are that looking at some sort of innovation in using distributed generation as a way to improve service reliability rather than as a way to, as a potential threat that is taking away business from the utility. I think there is some merit to this, and we may have to think of alternative grid codes and alternative use of technology to actually enable something like this. Finally, from here, I have, Matthew, how much time do I have?
Yeah, so we may have another 20 minutes. So
all right. Okay,
that's
so
fine.
I'll very quickly run through some of the other slides that I have. But are there any questions on what I have just discussed? Before I start with anything new, I would just like to ask if there are any questions. All right. So let me go ahead with the next topic. So as you saw in the earlier sections, these tie lines play quite a bit of a role in service restoration, but tie lines can also play another role, and that is in loss reduction. And I'm going to talk about that for a bit. So India has one of the largest transmission and distribution losses. And if you were to reduce loss, that implies more profit for the utility, because nobody pays for losses, right? On the utility network, if there are more losses in the network, it's only the utility that is losing business and is in fact having to make up for these losses at some marginal tariffs. So it's in the utility's best interest to make sure that they reduce the network losses. Now, how do they actually do something like this? So traditionally, this feeder reconfiguration problem has been used to identify the best possible operating topology for a network so that the network can operate in a mode which has better voltage profiles, better loss profiles, and so on. So this is the problem. At a very abstract level, what is this feeder reconfiguration problem? You have a network. Let's say this. Are you able to see this? This is node 1, this is node 2, this is node 3, node 4, node 5, and node 6, right? And then there's a tie switch here. Everybody recalls what is a tie switch? This is a normally open switch, okay? So in its current form, this network would operate like a tree, right? It's a tree structure because this is an open switch. Now the question is, do you want to run it in this manner, or do you want to keep this switch open and run it in this manner, or do you want to keep this switch open and run it in this manner, right? This is the main question that a feeder reconfiguration problem solves. Which switches should serve as sectionalizing switches, which are going to be closed, and which switches should serve as tie switches, which are going to be kept open? That is the main question. All right. And so the reason you look at this problem is because this helps you decide which topology gives you the best loss performance, best voltage performance, best service restoration possibilities, best load balancing, best reliability, and so on and so forth. So this problem is usually solved to optimize any of these objectives, and the constraints could be power flow constraints, topology related constraints, which means you want the network to be operated as a radial system, you want all sources, all sinks to be connected to the substation, you want voltage drops to be within a particular margin, and so on and so forth. So what we tried to bring in was a more robust modeling of the reliability that each topology can give. Here we basically had the same sort of reliability indices. How do you actually model it as a function of the network topology? That was the main question. And I will not get into too many technical details here, but what we tried to introduce was basically the concept of a path. The reliability that any load at a network will give is going to be the sum of all the, it's going to be a function of all the reliabilities of upstream events, upstream links. And that means that the path that I have to traverse from the substation to reach that node, that path is the one that is going to be setting the reliability I receive at that node. So by improving the reliability, what I'm trying to do is basically pick a topology that overall improves the reliability of each service point, which means each path is optimized. So instead of doing the usual feeder reconfiguration problems involve doing a link selection, which links would be active, what we cast the problem as is which paths should be active. And by looking at the path selection problem, we were able to bring in a more robust reliability model that we have explained here. And as I said, I don't have time to get into the analytical basis of it, but we basically translated this into a path selection problem, verified that this reliability model actually works quite well, and then we cast it as linear constraints in your integer integer decision variables, where the decision variables are which path is going to be active. So we formulated this entire problem and then used it to optimize trade-offs between loss and reliability. So the usual loss reduction objective can be augmented with a reliability objective also. And you can see, for example, that if you were to want the best reliability, then your losses may be slightly higher. Loss is shown here. And if you were to improve on the loss, then you may take a hit on the reliability. So somehow you have to be able to do traverse the Pareto frontier between this loss and reliability objectives. So having an optimization framework allows you to do these trade-offs a lot more in a lot more robust and analytical manner. So this paper is also published. It is here. This is the paper. It was published in 2019 in IEEE Systems Journal. More importantly, what happens if a particular grid does not have these tie lines at all? So that question was also addressed. Very recently in 2021, we've published some work on how do you identify where to place the tie lines, because that's a very important problem. So the distribution network is the closest point of interconnection to an end user. And so if you were to improve the service reliability because you have identified the best tie lines, you have identified the best operating strategy, you can significantly improve the service experience that a consumer gets. And that was the whole motivation behind looking at this. So what we tried to do now is, in addition to knowing that the reliability is a function of the path, we also want to see if we were to change the topology itself, what topologies are available, are we going to improve the reliability? Because now the number of connections possible can also become a function, can impact your reliability, and that is what we wanted to optimize on. So let me give you a short example here. If you look at this 14 bus feeder, right? If there was an interruption in this 2x4 link, you can see I'm highlighting this link. Can you see this? If I was to lose this link because of a fault, 4 and 5 would not be completely restored until I energize this, I close this normally open switch between 5 and 14. That makes sense to everybody, correct? The other Matthew had pointed this out, right? If there was a fault on 2.4, this entire feeder would be de-energized first, and then there would be an isolation of 2,4, and then this supply would be restored, and the supply here would be restored by switching on this 5.14 normally open switch. Okay? Everybody sees this? But if I was to lose this link 7,10, is there a possibility of restoring supply to this node 10 through any rerouting? Anybody? Any thoughts? Can you restore the supply to node 10 if I was to lose this 7,10 link? Is it possible? There is no rerouting option available for this node, right? You guys can see that? Everybody can see that?
Yeah, there is no option.
There is no option, right? So basically, maybe if you want to make sure that each of your nodes has a possibility of getting power through some other new routes, then you have to do an investment in this system. Maybe you could put a new tie line between 3 and 10, or you could put a tie line between 10 and 8, whatever may be the case, but that investment is needed. The question we tried to address was, where do you get the most bang for the buck? Where do you place these new tie lines so that your service restoration possibilities are significantly improved? And again, we have to look at cost benefit trade-offs here, right? So what we tried to do was we brought in the concept of, again, from graph theory, we brought in the concept of edge connectivity. What edge connectivity does for a graph, it basically tells you how many options are possible, how many possible paths are there to reach a particular node in the network. And if you have 2 paths at least to reach your substation, then automatically that means that if one path was to fail, you have an alternative available. And in doing so, you have introduced redundancy, and each node would thus have an alternative rerouting of power possible for it, making it what we call as 2 edge connected. And sometimes there can even be 3 options. So basically, 3 edge connectivity of 3 at a particular location means that there are 3 separate paths available to reach that location. But for us, it's enough for us to at least have 2 edge connections at all possible nodes. And we tried to bring in this concept of 2 edge connecting the network. Now, again, to cut a long story short, as a graph theory problem also, this is a hard problem to solve. And there were algorithms in graph theory that gave in some suboptimality. What we did was we leveraged the structure of a distribution network to essentially bring in a proper mixed integer programming formulation to identify the best possible connections. And by doing that, we were able to bring in more practical concepts like cost of a line. So for example, if you were to just do, you don't care about which lines to put. So if you had a graph like this, there are so many options possible. So you know that if I was to put this line between 3 and 5, that's going to be the best possible line for me, because my graph would automatically, each node now has 2 ways to reach the substation. This node 2 can reach substation directly like this, or it can reach through this longer path. Same for node 3. It can reach like this, or it can reach through this path. And same for all these other nodes. But if I was to just look at an algorithm that gives me this solution, although this is the minimal sort of, in terms of number of tie lines, this is the best possible solution. But it ignores the fact that maybe this is a very costly connection. Right? There could be a mountain sitting here, and I would have to dig through that mountain, dig a tunnel through that mountain to connect node 3 and 5, right? Alternatively, it might be better not to do this, but in fact, connect a new line between 2 and 5 and new line between 3 and 4. These are both going to be tie lines. Although the number of tie lines is more than this solution, the fact that I don't have to dig through the mountain makes this more of an economically attractive option for the utility than just looking at a graph algorithm that just looks at reducing the number of tie lines that you have to add. Does that make sense to everybody? Are you following what I'm saying? Okay. So the main way to go about, again, putting structure to this sort of a problem is to first define, okay, how do I know where I have to make the investments? So for that, it becomes important to identify buses where there are no restoration possibilities. And these are typically tied in with a line whose outage is going to leave the bus with no restoration possibilities. So these are what we refer to as critical lines. The buses that get affected by the loss of that critical line are what we call as affected buses. And we put a whole structure to this and try to identify how to go through this whole augmentation process. Again, as I said, a whole mixed integer linear programming formulation was done to go through this whole algorithm and give a solution to this problem that hitherto did not exist in graph theory also. The other thing we tried to do was maybe, having restoration possibilities for all parts of the network may not be a good idea. So we tied it up with our earlier work of distributed microgrid operations, dynamic microgrid operations, and tried to say that, okay, we'll not look for paths always to the substation, but we are okay as long as we have a path to some robust local source. So in that way, we don't aim for, improving the overall connectivity of all parts of the network. What we would try to do is improve connectivity to source parts of the network. And that had a lot of implications, again, as far as service reliability is concerned. So for instance, what I had shown earlier, right? We were to construct a graph, we were to add these two lines instead of this one line here through the mountain. But what if this node 3 is not that critical? We can just do with one augmentation. Okay, so we make sure that there are certain parts of the network that are critical to us that would always find a way to the source or to some local supply. That was the whole idea. And I think I'll stop here because Matthew, should I continue, or would this be a good time to take questions?
Yeah, maybe you can take some questions.
Yeah, I think that might be a good idea. So, any questions from the audience? Let me go ahead and yeah, I'll take questions from the audience maybe.
Ma'am, I have one query.
Yeah, go ahead.
Since you are talking about the last part where the connectivity you were showing using graph theory by one particular line, tie line, and the other way, which was more economical with two tie lines.
Correct. Is this the? Let me bring that up, and I want to. This
yes,
one?
yes, ma'am. So this on which system are you testing, ma'am? Is it standard IEEE 33 bus system or some?
Yeah, so
other
for the example, we just gave this simple system that we had made, but the tests were conducted on IEEE distribution feeders.
Okay, ma'am, then I have one issue with that. Since IEEE 33 bus system is not defining any specific geographic topology. So in that case, decision of where the mountain is or what will be the latitude and longitude of that. So can we superimpose on some local region and then we can validate this?
So for us, we were able to get some GIS data for the IEEE 33 bus system from a different paper, and we leveraged that to bring in our cost practicalities for each line. So the way we did this was this line 3.5 would be more costly because of the GIS information as well as the length of the line and so on. And these lines 2.5 or 3.4 would be less costly because of, again, the GIS information or the length of the line. But that information was not something that we generated. It was available in a different paper and we just sourced that paper.
Okay, ma'am. So can we do like that if such informations are not available? Can we superimpose any geographic location?
Yeah, correct.
Can we do that?
Yeah. That was exactly what the earlier paper had done. They wanted to bring in distances and some spatial distances and so on. That's why they had that GIS data for the 33 bus generated. So because it was a standardized data someone else had generated, we just borrowed that data. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. And one more question I have, ma'am, regarding the previous part where you were showing SCADA, and from SCADA you have the information related to enhance your reliability indices you were showing, SCIFI, SCID, those indices. There was a specific diagram, ma'am, where
let me, is it here?
DMS architecture you were showing.
Yeah. Is it this one?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So this dynamic microgrid configurator, SCADA informations were being used for assessment.
Yeah. So the way the microgrid boundaries are defined, they come about as a function of what's actually going on in the network, right? So if your supply demand conditions change, which would also manifest itself as different flows in the network, then that would basically get estimated through your network topology processor, SCADA, as well as your power flow and state estimator modules in the DMS, and that would be used to initialize your the way you want to partition your network into different microgrids. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. But I wanted to know that instead of SCADA, if since nowadays PMU are being used because of its high reporting rate and all, so if that would have been replaced by PMU, then would it be more advantageous for this assessment?
Yeah. So basically, whatever data acquisition system you have, even PMUs would go through their own data acquisition system, right? There's a PDC, like there'll be a phasor data concentrator and so on. So, I mean, you can replace SCADA with whatever modern data acquisition systems you have, but you would need some visibility of the network. That's the main point. You would need some network visibility module here, and what would be the state of the network is what you would then use to define your new microgrids, basically.
Okay, ma'am, I got you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Yes.
Any other question? Any question from anybody else?
Yeah, I think no more questions are there.
All right.
Yeah, so would you like to wind up or?
No, I think so. I let me see. I think I may have a few sort of closing thoughts here. Let me go ahead and just. I went through a few of these slides. I apologize. I went much slower than I usually do. So I was not able to cover the analytical basis of either the DFR work or. But if anybody has any questions, you can reach out to me. I am completely, all the information on how to reach out is available on the internet. So please go ahead and reach out. I am just quickly going to go to concluding remarks and yeah. So basically there is what I want to say in conclusion is there are a lot of behind the meter investments happening in terms of distributed energy resources and batteries and so on. That brings in a whole bunch of possibilities for utilities to rethink how they want to plan and operate their networks. So what we've been doing at our in our group is try to figure out some novel architectures in which that flexibility can be leveraged by utilities to improve the way they service their customers, to improve the overall economics for them. And this, of course, needs to go hand in hand with better communication possibilities, better protection, better incentives to make sure that these result in some significant performance improvement for the utilities as well as the consumers. And this is what I would like to conclude with. You can reach me on the following email address, and I will leave it at this. Is that okay, Matthew?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Anupam Madam, for the session on economics of smart grid. So we have a recorded session. So I'll share that with the participants later, so that they can go slowly through those content, and they can learn more from it. Actually, while planning this FDP, while writing a proposal for this FDP, the thing that was in my mind was the project that I have at a meeting that I attended while I was in IIT Bombay, which involved Anubhava Madam and Ankur Kulkarni and many others. So that project was SPORES, I think it is Smart Planning and Operations of Grids with Renewable and Storage. So that made me to think in that particular line and prepare the sessions like that. So it was my pleasure to have Anubhava ma'am in this program and to give a good session for the participants. I hope it is very useful for the participants and they can get in contact with you for any further related works. So on behalf of the department as well as on behalf of all present here, I would like to thank Anubhava ma'am for sparing her time with us and giving us valuable insights on the new aspects related to economics of smart grids. So thank you very much, Anubhava ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. And I apologize if this wasn't too much about economics and more about reliability. But I mean, reliability and economics, in my opinion, go really hand in hand. So I hope I tried to do justice to the topic you asked me to talk about. But maybe in a year or so, I will have a lot more on real economics, because I have two new projects on the economic design of economics for smart grids, and how do players participate in electricity markets and so on with Indian data. But that's a lot of it is still work in progress. So I was very hesitant to present it, but maybe in a year I'll be in a better position, Matthew. You can call me back in a year. I'll be happy to talk about more economics then.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you, madam.
Thank you.
So we'll stop for today. Tomorrow morning we will start with the next session. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock we have the session on peer-to-peer energy trading by Dr. MP Selvan from NIT Trichy. So you can join in the same link, and the feedback and attendance link is shared in the chat box. So please feel free to complete the feedback, and we'll meet tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in the same link.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. It was a pleasure to talk to all of you.
Okay, thank you.